Glass is the most fascinating materials ever. It's full of contradiction. It's a liquid, but it's solid, can be transparent and can be opaque, just full of contradiction and beauty. And then how glass become a reflection of wealth and so on. This idea of how societies and different cultures accept at the level of acceptance of glass in buildings, and then how this glass have changed those societies and those cultures as well. That is quite exciting. And since then, I really believed in this sort of power of materials in shaping our lives.
In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipf, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. Welcome, Professor Hisham Elkadi, to today's episode of Building Green. You're Chair of Architecture at the University of Salford and an expert in sustainable urban development. With a career spanning over 40 years, you have been essential in transforming cities around the world, advocating for integration of ecological principles in urban planning. I'm excited to discuss the complexities of sustainable cities, the innovative use of building materials like graphene, and the intersection of traditional techniques and modern technology in architecture. It's a pleasure having you, Hisham.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me, Ladina.
So, Hisham, tell me your story. How did you get where you are today, and what made you want to go deeper into sustainability?
When I finished my architecture degree, I thought I was quite interested in the environmental study at the time. We are talking here about more than 40 years ago, right? So quite a long time. So I decided to do my master programs in environmental science. Nothing to do with architecture at all. I had things about genetic engineering, energy, ecology. So it was a taught programs, and I found it absolutely fascinating to do something completely different, but understanding that all related to what we are trying to do in architecture. And I learned so much from that. Then I moved and I did my PhD in Liverpool on the subject was about the ecological principles that guide urban design. And I tried to apply some of this knowledge that I had from environmental science. And since then, I really believe that our knowledge in architecture could be further improved and heightened by understanding of ecological system. And we are not talking here about mimicking ecological system or mimicking natural pattern or anything like that. I'm talking about the depth of the ecological principles that guide the natural evolution. And since I worked on this subject, I had 25 PhD students working on this subject, and I also applied it in reality. So I got involved in the development of cities in Australia, in the United Kingdom, and in other parts of the world.
I'm very excited to go deeper into those urban plannings that you just mentioned. So last time we talked, if I recall correctly, you said in your doctoral thesis, you discussed the interesting paradox between energy efficiency and energy conservation.
Yes.
Could you share your perspective on why focusing on efficiency rather than just reducing usage is crucial?
Well, it is interesting because at that time when I did my PhD, and again, that's 1984, so that's 40 years ago when I started my PhD, there was that debate still going on between the idea of limits to growth, of course, a very famous book in 1972, and they with the idea that when Apollo went up and saw Earth as a little dot in the sky, and they thought that what we call the spaceship analogy, that this little planet is limited with resources, and we should therefore reduce the use of energy and use of resources in order to maintain it for a long time. And of course, to counter that, there was also the debate of no. This is true, but we have the technology to improve and do things differently. And funny enough, I think that paradox for sustainable cities and for our ideas about sustainable architecture is still debatable until today. And there is that sort of paradox between energy efficiency and energy conservation, for example, between mobility and containment, between technology and heritage. So, and you got different group, and I'm sure in your program you have these different views coming through, which is exciting. But it's very important to understand that paradox. We need to really engage with the paradox rather than take one side or another. So let me say, for example, energy. So there would be a strong movement in 1980s, and it continue to a certain limit till today, about how to conserve energy all the time. From my studies, from my work, nature does not conserve energy. Actually, nature use as much energy as possible, but optimize it. So the idea here is to use energy efficiently, not to conserve and reduce the use of energy. And that is, of course, two very different approach to architecture and urban design and the making of cities. So I really strongly believe that we should not try to reduce the use of energy, but maximize the efficiency of our use of energy, just like natural system, which is really the one of the principle of thermodynamics, about power principles, that we must use it energy in closed loops and recycling and so on. Make sure that you use renewable energy, of course, as a beginning of the source. How to use energy in our system in small increments. So we let small increments going out of our processes and so on. So all these principles that shape and try to understand and that paradox between energy conservation and energy efficiency, I think it's very important for architects to understand.
Could you give specific examples of architecture or in architectural practices of how we could implement that practically?
Yeah, right. Take, for example, facades, building facades. So how we understand our facades is very important. And the idea, and I worked on intelligent skin and intelligent facade for some time. But there is tendency here to make sure that we stop energy coming through, rather than have to understand how energy behaves and natural system generally, not only energy, but humidity and temperature and how the building skin can act as a theater for all these forces to work together. And we optimize the actor's performance in a way. So if you think about facade and the skin in this way, it will become a little bit different of the technicality of how we see the facade as a barrier. So it's not a barrier, it's a theater, it's a little circus, if you know what I mean. And we need to look at it in that sense. How we do that is through a lot of understanding and technological advance that we have. We use sensors to feel, to learn how the facade can learn from the information around it, because the facade has to be aware of the context of the theater, right? Understand the temperature, understand learning from history of data that affect them, the wind speed, the wind direction, and so on and so on. So building facade has to be that sort of elements that can learn, that we can design it better, but it also can learn, and then after learning, it can adapt, just like any ecological system, right? So, for example, I'll give you another example. If I have a pen, we talk about resilience. So if I have a pen like that, if I press on it until it breaks. That's what we call it is resilient or not, right? But in architecture, we do that everywhere. We test resilience of different elements and so on. But natural system doesn't work like that. So natural system works like if I put a lot of force in a branch or something, it bent. And it bent a little bit. And its performance became something slightly different. So can our system become that sort of learning and adaptable and so on, and not necessarily going back to its original function? So we need that sort of flexibility in our architecture, our design. How far we are from that, I don't know. But if you think about it, if you think in a larger scale, for example, in flooding, for example, when we talk about flooding, I have an article about living with ducks, for example, that we really need to be adaptable, that when the floods come, we don't have a system to resist it, but a system to accommodate it.
So talking about or picking up the topic of the bigger scale, you have played an important role in the urban development of Australia's city Geelong.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about the ecological principles you implemented and how the city benefited from these principles?
Yeah, before Geelong, I worked and start getting involved in the development of a number of cities. I'm starting with I was a lecturer in Newcastle upon time when during the development of the quayside. And I learned so much from my colleagues and my professors at the time on how the development of how cities evolve generally, and how can we bring the cities to the river, particularly in the case of Newcastle. And many cities in Europe at the time were moving to the river. So that sort of, and I learned that politics is very important when you talk about it. It's not just our ideas, it's how to engage with the city, the role of people, which was part of my PhD as well. In that understanding of ecological principles, we also have to understand the cultural aspect and the social aspects of the city. So putting them together, I start to notice them first when the development of the quayside in Newcastle. Then I moved to Belfast and I became the advisor to the Minister of Culture in Belfast. And in the time we were developing the Titanic Quarter. And that was an idea that we proposed and pushed forward. And I'm very pleased that the Titanic Quarter is seen as one of the best successful projects in Belfast to extend the city centre. But we try to apply some of the ideas we had in previously, my experience previously. And then I moved to Geelong. I'm not going into details about the development in those cities, but Geelong became the most important project for me because I was able to apply the ecological principles I have been talking about for so long in the city. So one of the things we developed there is to, let me give you a little bit of background so the listener will appreciate the problems we face there. So Geelong is a beautiful city, large city in European standards, about 350,000 people. Next to Melbourne. So Melbourne is always very big, and everybody talk about Melbourne, while Geelong, while it is 300,000 people, about 80 kilometers from Melbourne, had a lower profile. And it's industrial city. So for the industry there. So it, just like many industrial cities have really slowed down economically and had many problems. There was a problem of the city center. And we looked at how to regenerate that city center. It's a beautiful, beautiful city with a beautiful bay facing south. Facing north in the equivalent to the south for us. So got a lot of sunshine coming to the bay. It's just beautiful, so beautiful. But it was suffering a lot. So, and the other problem they have a lot of, just like many cities in Australia, it suffers from the floods and drought. And this cycle become very problem because when the floods come, it filled the city center. It has two beautiful botanic gardens on both sides of the city and the high street in between. So the idea was to apply some of this ecological principle and make it an ecological system by harness the water from floods under the botanic gardens and create a green spine that would link the two botanic garden and irrigated by those tanks under the ground. And we also, it has also links and planning for housing and health activity and so on. But it's all based on that sort of ecological spine that we create in the heart of the city. And it worked very well. And it wasn't easy because when you think building green, that's your topic. It's not easy to convince everybody around you, but you have to be strong. I was the head of school there, and I had very good relationship with the council, and we're pushing. And I got a small grant from state government to do a vision for the city. And it just, if you have the will, you can really do things, right? We talked before about this paradox and this confusion about what we should and shouldn't do. But you really have to understand and believe that our natural system is the most smart system, right? You can't have smart cities without understanding the natural system because we can't be more smart than the nature anyway. So I don't know what people are talking about. They just like, you have to understand how nature works and learn from them. So, and I remember that I give you just an example of how things can go when you insist. So we wanted to take the trucks were going through the city center in Geelong. Large trucks going through the city center. And of course, that disrupts everything in a beautiful city that live by the ocean. And so you got these stupid trucks going across all the time. And so the first thing we wanted to do is to create this green spine irrigated by the water, flood water and tanks and so on, link the two botanic gardens and make it green. And traffic engineer came to me and said, absolutely impossible. No way. You can't take traffic out of the city center. I said, let's take trucks out first and then we'll take the rest. No way. This is a major artery. All the trucks coming through there. It link parts of Victoria. There is no way. So I said, well, in my PhD, I did some transport modeling and I understand that, you really, it depends on the variable you put. No. So I said, all right, we'll make a survey. Why people are taking that road rather than going, there is a ring road around it, a little bit longer, but not by far. Like the difference was about 7 minutes or something. And of course, if you go through the city center with the traffic, with the traffic lights and so on. So we did a survey against their will. All right. And I'm sorry for any traffic engineers who are listening to this blog. And what we asked the truck driver, why do you take that road? It's busy, it's traffic, it's horrible. While the other one is maybe a few minutes longer, but it's easier. Like you can go around in a motorway. And what we found is they came, and the survey was saying that all the lorry drivers, they just want to go through the city because they wanted to look at girls. That was the reason. So there was nothing to do with efficiency. There was nothing to do with transport engineer, because in Australia, those truck drivers, they spend hours not seeing anybody, on big roads and so on. So they love to go through Geelong just to look at people. So I convinced everybody after this that no, just stop it. And we stopped it. And then we stopped all traffic going through the city. And now we have a beautiful green spine going through Geelong. And that, what happened, the result of that, the important thing is, the result of that is we should not only talk about green up, but we should really think about how that would work for the city, how we make beautiful, not only beautiful city, but economically viable city. The work which we did with a project called Vision 2 has led to economic growth of the city. A lot of people moved into the city because how beautiful it become the city center and so on. The economics of the city center changed dramatically, and that led to a net worth of about 6 billion Australian dollars economic benefits to Geelong. It is just an example of how, when you insist on having your beliefs and you be strong about it, and you have the theoretical backing to what you want to do, and with a lot of political maneuvers as well, because it's all about politics as well at the end of the day. Putting all that together would lead to hopefully a better green environment and built environment for us.
That's a great story. So regarding green infrastructure, can you talk about some of the risks you see in today's sustainable cities?
Yeah. As I said, when we did Geelong, and we talked about the development of the green spine in Geelong, I learned so much. I learned so much from so many people, from different background and different, because we got everybody to talk about flooding, about hydrology of the city, about what type of plant we should put in the green spine, how we can get people to participate in that green spine. So there was a social aspect, there was horticultural aspect, there was a technology, there was engineering, and I learned so much. So when I returned back to Manchester here, and I became part of the what we call Green City Forum, which led by Andy Burnham, the mayor of Greater Manchester, and he is very ambitious to create. I mean, there is a little bit of every city thing that they would like to be the best and achieve the first net zero carbon emission and so on. But I found, the two cities really I was involved in, and I found them extremely amazing on developing system for that. Was first Melbourne. I think Melbourne is a great city with great potential and great mind behind that tried to build that environmental sustainability, truthful environmental sustainability of the city. But also Manchester on the other scale, which is really very grey city. I think Manchester is the least green city in the United Kingdom. So to be in there and try to do something was first hard. But because of the political will, because of the council and the Greater Manchester Combined Authority push, and the Manchester Council as well, towards greening, great things are happening in Manchester. Really, really great things. So one of the projects I got involved in is how to greening up Manchester with about 10% by 2030. So we work in the green infrastructure. So we made a lot of labs because our understanding of green infrastructure, from my knowledge in Geelong as well, is very limited. It's really, really limited. I'm sure you have a lot of listeners think they are expert in the subject and so on, and probably they are. But the overall picture of how green infrastructure work in the built environment, the performance, how much exactly they help energy efficiency of building as a second skin, and so on, is very limited. One of the things which I would like to raise here, which came out of that project, is that, of course, with climate change, drying up becomes the norm in Europe. So a lot of green walls which we built, a lot of green roofs we built, start to dry up. I was in Vienna a few months ago, and I saw that for myself, where they have a real issue about green walls and green roofs drying up. Why this is a huge problem. And in London as well, we have the same problem. Because once the green the walls start to dry up, it became fire risks. And if we have a fire risk next to the building, especially after Grenfell and all the problems we had in London with the fires, insurance company withdrew their insurance from the building. And if they do, the building worth nothing, zero. So, of course, and we found that a lot of people start taking off the green walls from their building, which is another difficult issue. So we really needed to have a system that maintain green walls and green infrastructure. So when we do green infrastructure, we have to understand how it would work autonomously. How we create a system that it's autonomous, maintain and support and irrigate that system properly. So it's not just let the climbers go on top of buildings without any control and without any idea of how this can be maintained or the risk they would take. Because if we do that, we are doing disservice to architecture rather than helping. So we really, the project was to monitor what type of plant. We realized, for example, another exciting thing, we realized that when you put some plants next to each other, some plants thrive, work very well. They love each other. And some plants hate each other. And I never thought this could be possible. I thought it must be something to do with insects or something. We don't know what it is exactly, but not all plants work together in the green wall perfectly. We still don't know. We're still learning. And I encourage your listener and all the architects you're engaging with to to learn more about all that and read more. And we try to build that information about it. So it is, and we need to use technology as much as possible for the maintenance and detection. So part of what came out of this project, for example, and we worked with Coimbra in Portugal, because they have a problem of fires a few years ago. Because what we said, that plants are like us in a way, that the leaves, when they get stressed, they get hot. Just like when we get sick, when we get ill, we get hot. The leaves, they do the same. When they are stressed for a disease or stressed for drought, right? They got hotter. And we monitor that using drones on top of them, so we can detect that. What did that mean? That we can detect when they are stressed before they change color. So we don't wait till they become yellowish to understand there is a fire risk here. We can detect that much, much earlier, so we can do something about it much, much earlier. So we work with Coimbra, try to do that, looking if we have the drones on top of the forest, for example, can we detect where the stress, where the drought could have happened earlier on, so we don't have fires. So a lot to learn, and it is this combination of understanding nature, understanding ecological principle, and combined with our advancing technology as well.
A few of you might know that I recently opened my own architecture studio, and I just started with the podcast. I'm very excited to build a platform where I connect with inspiring people to learn along the way and share these learnings with you. So if any little thing has inspired you, or if you learned anything new, I'd appreciate if you could rate the show or share my content on social media, Spotify or YouTube, or wherever you listen to it. And if you think there are any touch points between you and me, I'd be super happy to connect with you. Feel free to reach out on any platform. We've talked about integrating ecological principles with traditional building methods.
Yeah.
How do you see ancient techniques like those used by the Egyptians, for example, influencing modern sustainable architecture?
Yeah. Well, the more you read in history, the more you realize in architecture we haven't advanced that much for 7,000 years. But the idea that we learn from tradition is a must as well. Because in the beginning, humanity learned from trial and errors for thousands of years. So they worked with nature, because we didn't have that sort of technology that resists nature, that what we have nowadays. So we really need to learn from this tradition. One of the good example I have is actually maybe not in Egyptian. I'll come back to Egyptian later on. Is in Bilbao. Bilbao is like having like a raised surface towards the river. So when floods come, it goes up, and all the shops there, they will have 2 or 3 steps there. So it works with the flood. So the flood would come to the city, they accepted it, and this disappear from the city. That sort I mentioned before, living with ducks, that's another example where they understood not to resist so much nature. It's about 10 years ago now, where I was invited in New Orleans to visit the levees after Katrina destroyed the city and so on. So we were taking for a tour, and I asked, so the United States, used billions of dollars for the levees there and so on. So I said, if you have another Katrina, would those levees stand? And the answer was no. It was, they still, if they have Katrina, they will still have problems. So Another Katrina, I mean. So we really have to understand not to resist natural system, but work with it somehow. And heritage, we learn so much from heritage, from tradition, of how not everything in heritage is good and perfect, and we have to keep. And this is another thing we always get excited about it, that if it's heritage, it must be great. There are elements that we should learn from it, and we need to search for those elements, why they are the way they are, and how can we do them, and how can we learn from them, and how can we use our technology in order to enhance those systems. There is a romantic side, of course, of our heritage, which we love very much, and we love to go to Altstadt and old cities and roaming around there, and we feel the history and the romance of that. But that's about the environment and our mental ability to absorb and reflect. But when we come to building architecture, we need to go deeper a little bit to understand the principle that guided those buildings and learn the good example, but not just replicate the old building of all time just because we feel strongly attached to them.
And what do you think about cultures of glass architecture?
Yeah, well, that's my passion, really, because as I was involved in the building skin and building technology, I had a couple of books on glass and another on daylight, because I believe that glass is the most fascinating materials ever. I mean, it's talking about the paradox. It's full of contradiction. It's a liquid, but it's solid. It is can be transparent and can be opaque. You can put a little bit of color to it, and you can put electricity in it, and you can turn it off. I mean, it's just full of contradiction and beauty. During while I was writing my book, I learned how the evolution of glass have gone with the evolution of architecture and vice versa. So it is a beautiful story of how glass work in particular culture, because it is a very cultural material as well. I mean, if you look at history and how different culture adopt or reject glass and what it means to different culture, it's a beautiful thing to think about. And then if you add that daylight and how it shape our architecture and how glass have manipulated daylight, and we have different lives in a way because of that combination and that manipulation of daylight through the skin, through glass, and even with the Gothic and the stories. And I mean, everything about glass is exciting. I can't remember your question now because I get so excited about glass.
So we were talking about ancient building techniques.
Yeah.
And after that, I wanted to know what you think about cultures of glass architecture.
Yeah. So I was referring to that as well, about this idea of the different culture and how they adopt different type of glass first, and how it moves. And I was born in Alexandria, that's where glass started, of course. So it's very exciting for me personally. But how the British, for example, how glass came to England, and how it came through the monks moving, and with their connection, the monk in the north east of England, and with their connection to Belgium in particular, where glass works flourished at the time, and how they provide a small little circle of glass in one of the churches in the northeast of England, and how the perception of that glass and why it wasn't very much accepted and flourished in England while it was flourishing in places like Belgium and northern France. What happened there and why the German adopted the glass and were more interested in the glass vessels and glasswares rather than in building. And then how glass become a reflection of wealth and so on. So this idea of how societies and different culture accept at the level of acceptance of glass in buildings, and then how this glass have changed those societies and those cultures as well. That is quite exciting. So this is one of the materials. And since then, I really believed in this sort of the strength and the power of materials in shaping our lives. You can see that all around us now, but we still have not adopted that strongly in architecture. We're still very slow in using and applying new technology and new materials. And we need to speed that up a little bit. There is so many beautiful materials around us that we are not using at all. And which will make huge difference to our culture and society, and will change the way we look at our building and how we build and how we design.
You just touched the topic of building materials. What sustainable or innovative building materials have you worked with?
Yeah. Of course, because I'm excited and love glass so much. So I experiment with glass so many times in so many ways. And I do believe that glass have the potential, whether we are doing it in double skin or triple skin, or whether we work with different filming and whether we put electricity in it to turn it on and off. But also glass have the potentials to put sensors in them that we will be able to learn. I mentioned before, learning and adapting. So glass will enable us to do to all that. But one of the recently, since I came back from Australia to Manchester, and we get involved a little bit with the Graphene Center in Manchester. Graphene Center, when I was in Australia and I was the head of school at Deakin University, we had a lot of many labs in graphites, the work of graphites and carbon fibers, and how carbon fibers can be used in there. And we did some work of how carbon fibers can be used in some elements in materials of building facades and so on. That is one example that carbon fibers have been used in building boats and masts and in tennis, in so many applications. But we haven't really adopted that enough in architecture, for example. So anyway, in Australia, I was involved in the carbon fibers and I was excited about its application in architecture. But when I came to Manchester and I saw this huge work going on what we call graphene, which is a little bit much more advanced material than the carbon fibers, we became very excited about that. And we started to have I understand Graphene have worked with Graphene Institute, worked with the Highway England, making roads. So we start using it in roads, for example, because it's a material that's incredibly strong, and we really made a transformation. So when we thought that how if we use it with cement, for example, what would be the outcome? We found that the strength of a slab of any concrete coming out would be reduced of that cement could reduce the structural element by as much as 25% to 30%. That is huge. The
Wow.
impact of that in architecture and construction is huge. So they start using it in surface of motorways very successfully. It's still expensive, but that's how everything starts anyway. But now I believe that there is a building, the first building that made of using carbon fibers, not carbon fibers, graphene, will be built in Dubai this year. It's already underway. Why this is exciting? This is exciting for so many reasons. The obvious one, that it would reduce the use of cement by 25% or 30%, which is huge environmentally, because cement is the most unfriendly carbon usage in the construction industry. It will reduce the transport of that cement by 20%. It would reduce the structural components by 20-25%. But think about that. If you do that, what type of building can we build? What type of, how thin our structural components would be? What did that would say about our design? How can we move forward from that? So the implication of that, and I'm not sure I would like to say this is like a magic material, like everybody look at graphene, but it's one of those very advanced material that already now in the market, that I know, for example, that Nike was using them for the sole of their, you go to Nike shoes and you can buy with, it said graphene technology or something like that underneath. So how can we really speed up the use of that and the impact of sustainability and greening up cities and so on? It's huge. It goes now to the very tiny detailing of our building and our design. We need to engage with that, because if we don't, I'm talking about architect, if we don't, somebody else will. And we became dinosaurs on the past, that we still work with stone and so on. I'm not saying that we don't work with stone, but we also need to understand technology and materials and adopt those new interventions.
Thank you so much for all your insights, Hisham. If our listeners want to follow your work, where can they find you?
I guess if you just put my name there, there will be a lot of contacts and my email and so on, or on Twitter. I think my Twitter is Hisham Elkadi, one word, at Hisham Elkadi. And my email is my University of Salford email, and it's very easy to get that.
Okay, I'll share that in the links below, or your LinkedIn profile. Thank you very much, Hisham. It has been a pleasure.
I enjoyed that, Ladina. Thank you very much for initiating this, and it's a great idea. What you're doing is a great one.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at Ladina Schipf. Thanks.